a whole playlist that covers various chord voicings that are commonly used in jazz. But I thought it would be worthwhile making a quick video about some general chord voicing rules and discuss how to create and resolve tension through a chord progression. So when playing a chord, there are really only two things you need to take account of. The chord itself, that is, the notes that make up the chord, and the chord voicing, that is, the order in which you play the notes and the intervals between the notes. Now, the first aspect is easy enough. You have to play the notes of the chord that's actually written, with any kind of extensions or alterations, if you like. Now, you have to play the guide tones of the chord, that is the third and the seventh, as these determine the quality of the chord. And you don't have to play the root or the fifth. But you can put the root at the bottom in the bass to really emphasize the tonality of the chord if you wish, though this is often done by the bass player anyway. And of course you can add tensions on top of your seventh chords, so adding ninths, elevenths and thirteenths. So if, for example, we have a C major 7 chord, then you could play a C major 7, a C major 9, a C major 9 sharp 11, a C major 13, or a C major 13 sharp 11. Making sure to only use available tensions over that chord. And if you don't know what available tensions are, then I've got a separate video you should watch which explains them. And as I said before, you can omit the root or the fifth in any of these chords. So for example, you could play a C major 13 as follows: E, B, D, and A. So that's the 3rd, 7th, 9th, and 13th of a C major 13 chord, and so we've obviously omitted the root, the 5th, and the 11th. And so the more extended and altered a particular chord is, the more tension you will create with that chord. Now, the voicing of the chord depends on the intervals between the notes. And so you can alter the tension or the dissonance of the chord by altering the voicing of the chord that you're playing, even if you're playing all of the same notes. So voicing a chord with a lot of consonant intervals like perfect fifths or perfect fourths or major thirds or minor thirds will give you a really consonant and pleasant sounding chord voicing. Whereas voicing a chord with lots of dissonant intervals like a tritone or a semitone or a tone or a flat 9 interval will give you a really dissonant sounding chord voicing. So for example, if we play a C major 13 sharp 11 chord, one of the most consonant voicings you can use is with tertian harmony, or just stacked thirds. So C, E, G, B, D, F sharp, A. So you avoid all of those dissonant intervals, right? There are no semitone or tritone intervals between any of these notes. And the most dissonant voicing you could use is with secundal harmony, or tone clusters, where you just play each note after the other. For example, C, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C. Right, so that's got lots of semitones and tones and tritone intervals in that particular chord voicing. But the idea is, of course, to use some consonant intervals and some dissonant intervals. So for example, using quartal harmony, you could voice that chord as follows: B, E, A, D, G, C, F sharp. Right, so there's that one tritone interval between the C and the F sharp, but otherwise they're all perfect fourth intervals. So there are many consonant intervals, but one dissonant interval. Or you could create your own little voicing. For example, again playing that same chord, you could go D, G, B, C, F sharp, A, E. So then that's got a semitone between the B and the C and a tritone between the C and the F. So again, we've used some consonant intervals, but some dissonant intervals. And by combining these consonant and dissonant intervals, you can create a much more interesting sounding chord voicing. Now, some general voicing rules are that you want to generally avoid using too many thirds because it sounds too boring. And that's precisely because of the reason that I showed you earlier. When you play a chord just stacked up in thirds, there are no dissonant intervals between any of those notes, and so it just sounds a little bit too pleasant and a little bit too safe and a little bit too boring. While using intervals of fourths and tritones creates a much more open and harmonically ambiguous sound. And so generally in jazz, you'll find that most chords are voiced using fourths rather than just your standard thirds. Now you should also generally play wider intervals at the bottom, because small intervals sound a little bit muddy in a low register. And you should generally play dissonant intervals like semitones or tones in the middle of the chord voicing, while playing a consonant interval like a third or a fourth between the two highest notes in your chord voicing generally sounds stronger. Though of course you can also play more dissonant intervals like tritones or semitones if you wish. And you should generally avoid doubling notes within a chord, as this makes the chord sound a little bit unbalanced. Except the top note of the chord, the soprano note, which can be doubled lower down. So for example, you could play a C major 13 as follows: E, B, C, D, A, C. So the C is doubled, but it's also the top note, so that's okay. And you should generally try to keep all your intervals smaller than a perfect fifth, except of course for the interval between the bottom two notes, which can be wider. And these are of course all guidelines, which can be broken whenever you want. They're just general rules to get a nice sounding chord voicing. But sometimes you may want a more dissonant sounding voicing, in which case you can break these rules, that's perfectly fine. And so, by altering the chord itself, by adding extensions or alterations, and the voicing of the chord, you can create and resolve tension while playing a chord progression. So for example, playing a 2-5-1 in the key of C major goes D minor 7 to G7 to C major 7. And in terms of tension, that goes low tension, high tension, because dominant chords are inherently high tension chords because they have a tritone interval between the third and the seventh, and then low tension or complete resolution. So if you wanted to, you could play a very high tension 2-5-1 in C without really resolving that tension too much. For example, by playing D minor 13 to G13 sharp 9 to C major 7 sharp 11. So altogether that sounds. Right, so that was a very high tension 2-5-1 in the key of C, which I didn't really resolve. So all the chord voicings I used were really dissonant and had a high degree of tension. And that's because the intervals between the notes in the chord voicings were very dissonant. For example, in the D minor 13, we had a semitone. In the G13 sharp 9, we had a semitone as well. And in the C major 7 sharp 11, we had a tone, a semitone, and a tritone between the F sharp and the C. And so now if I wanted to play a high tension 2-5-1 in C, but with a resolution, so resolving that tension, you could play a D minor 13 to a G13 sharp 9 to a C6. So altogether that would sound like this. So then the D minor 13 has a high degree of tension. The G13 sharp 9 also has a high degree of tension. And then the C6, you resolve that tension and it sounds really smooth and resolved. And again, that's because there are no semitone intervals or tritone intervals in that voicing. There is of course a tone interval, but that's not quite as dissonant. And so by altering the chord itself or the voicing of the chord, you can increase and decrease the tension of the chord progression. And so that's definitely something you should think about or keep at the back of your mind when you're comping or playing chords. And now, except for the chord and the voicing of the chord, the other thing you need to worry about is voice leading. That is, how you transition from one chord to the next. But I will leave that for another lesson. Otherwise, again, thanks for watching guys, and see you next time. Bye.